Oh, good morning. So, one year at Polytechnic School, where I used to teach, the assistant head of school started these discussions, and he called them Stone Soup. About once a month, a faculty member would present something to her colleagues, some bit of expertise or some new idea for what to teach or how to teach. One week, I presented a draft of a lesson idea based on American philosopher John Rawls. John Rawls' work was in the philosophy of justice. And so my idea involved a classroom activity that would help students link ideas of justice to ideas of empathy. There were members of the administration there, my bosses, and also my peer colleagues from various departments. I passed out a handout and I explained my thought process. People seemed receptive to the activity and to the link between justice and empathy. Then, about 10 or 15 minutes into the presentation, a young, white, male colleague walked in late. His name was Nathan. He sat down at the table. He did not pick up a handout. As soon as he had settled into a comfortable and authoritative posture, he interrupted me and said, are you at all interested in the concept of empathy? What on earth was I supposed to say? It was like walking in late to a Broadway show, interrupting the Rockettes and asking them if they were interested in dance. I said, as politely as I could, that empathy was actually what we had been discussing before he got there. Unfazed by all of the ideas that he had not been there to hear, he immediately offered corrections to all of the ideas he had not been there to hear, and to hijack the presentation. And all of the colleagues and supervisors present just leaned forward with rapt attention like he was Jesus Christ himself. I was done. I did not continue with my presentation. And I was done. Livid, embarrassed, betrayed. No one in the room had even noticed that this young man had just shut down a more experienced woman teacher. No one held him accountable for not listening or for speaking out of turn. And I did not hold my colleagues or supervisors accountable either for their egregious lack of leadership, because I was used to it. I was used to not being listened to. People outside of education sometimes use words like academic and intellectual to mean weak and effete, but if you're in education, you know academics can be brutal. Everything is an argument and a competition. You talk loud and long, you win. You respond fast, you win. You leave time for silence, you're done. You're actually right? Who cares? So toxic. And this toxicity is not limited to academia. It's everywhere, even sometimes in churches. We are so quick to talk and so slow to listen, the exact opposite of what James instructs in this passage, where he says we should be quick to listen and slow to speak. It feels awful not to be listened to, doesn't it? It's awful to feel like your voice has been taken away or diminished. And on the other hand, one of the greatest feelings in the world is being listened to. American naturalist Henry David Thoreau wrote in his book Walden, quote, "The greatest compliment that was ever paid me was when someone asked me what I thought and then attended to my answer. I counseled a man a few years ago, big, strong guy by all accounts, kind of a man's man, a little rough around the edges, I guess, and people tended to treat him like the tough guy he seemed to be. We had a first session, and he opened up about what he was struggling with. I started the second session, by reflecting on the previous session. I said something like, "Last week you shared with me about this, and I heard you struggling with this, in finding some strength in this." As I was talking, he looked at me with big eyes, and when I finished, he was overcome with emotion. He started to sob. He couldn't remember the last time he felt like someone had actually listened to him. He felt it deep in his soul. He felt the charge of being heard, being seen. He felt acknowledged. He felt like his inner world meant something to someone else. Attend to my answer, says Thoreau. Attend to my personhood, which may be different from your personhood. When someone speaks to us, they are inviting us into their world. When we listen, we step into that world. As listeners, we become the honored guests of the other's world. But too often, instead of behaving like honored guests, we behave like American tourists. We zip around the other's world to figure out what's worth our time, sticking to our timeline, popping in and out of meaningful places, checking the Lonely Planet guide of our assumptions and searching for only what we were told we would find. Jack Zimmerman and Virginia Coyle are spiritual practitioners who have studied and dedicated their lives to the art of heartful interaction. Here's how they describe our tendencies as listeners. Quote, "When the topic of an ordinary conversation is engaging, most of us listen until we sense the direction of what's being said, and then we begin preparing our response before the other person has finished talking. On the other hand, when we're not engaged in the topic of conversation, disinterest leads to intermittent listening, which leads to misunderstanding and irritation for all parties involved. Tuning in and out based on interest, listening for a bit, assuming and anticipating the rest, and then preparing remarks for our turn to speak. Zimmerman and Coyle's description fits equally well for a conversation with a neighbor, for a political debate, for a work meeting, and perhaps even for listening to sermons on Sunday morning. I know how it is. I listen well now, but I had been a fairly terrible listener in my life. And it wasn't because I didn't care about other people or because I had such a high opinion of myself. Actually, I was a terrible listener because of my insecurities. I had this hole of self-worth. And so I went through life not just appreciating affirmation, which is perfectly natural, but wanting, needing more and more attention, more and more respect, adoration, and love. It's a little embarrassing to admit, but I felt overcome by my need for others' love and approval, and also unable to achieve enough of it. And in my late 30s and early 40s, this unquenchable need brought me to where I felt spiritually stuck. And then I joined a group called Story Tribe, and things began to change for me. Story Tribe was based on the way of counsel, which itself is sort of based on Native American practices of tribal counsel. It's a method of creating space that invites people to speak and listen from the heart and spontaneously. Because of the invitations of counsel, I was unable to interact in the ways I normally did. Ironically, those constraints helped me become unstuck spiritually. Speaking from the heart meant not presenting a carefully curated version of myself in order to gain a particular response. Attention, laughter, respect. Listening from the heart meant setting aside all of my personal responses, all of my arguments, setting aside all of the ways that I could turn someone else into an opportunity for me to speak and impress. I sat in the Story Tribe circle every Thursday for 3 months. And then at the end of that, I signed up for another go-around. I was discovering that listening was not about me. And far from feeling alienated or decentered by this, I found myself instead feeling less alone in the world. I learned that I was not alone. You see, when we don't listen, when we instead plan what we will say next, it's all about the I, the capital I. It all comes back to the ego. But when we suspend the ego, when we learn it's not all about me, we become more than ourselves. When we take in another person's story in their own terms, we understand who they are. When we abandon the idea that we already know them or that we know better than they do, or when we abandon our habit of valuing what they say only insofar as it relates to us, then we have truly discovered the other, and we don't have to be alone. The power of listening, the power of being listened to, engenders positive change at all levels of relationship: intrapersonal, interpersonal, social, and political. So I'll leave you with a final story. Do you remember the Westboro Baptist Church? The church is basically the multi-generational family of the patriarch and founder of the church, Fred Phelps. They protest the funerals of servicemen, and they protest against LGBT rights everywhere. The Southern Poverty Law Center considers them arguably the most obnoxious and rabid hate group in America. They hold signs that say God hates Jews, God hates fags. They harass grieving families, wives, husbands, children, and their violent rhetoric makes the world a less safe place for sexual and gender minorities. Everywhere they go, there are counter-protests. Every online post of theirs engenders angry, loud vitriol in response. Of course, naturally, they are reprehensible. But one year, Fred Phelps's granddaughter, Megan Phelps Roper, started taking to Twitter to defend the Westboro Baptist Church's positions against all of the unclean, unsaved heathens who were then screaming their righteous anger against the Westboro Baptist Church. And then something different happened on Twitter. A couple of Twitter users took the time to understand Westboro's doctrines. They listened to the church's perspective. This took Megan Phelps Roper by surprise. This was different, in a pleasant way. The dialogue continued, and as the Twitter users asked more questions and learned more about Megan's beliefs, they gained Megan's respect. She saw them as more than just unclean. And as they asked more questions and learned more about the church, they were able to point to contradictions in the church's positions that Megan had not noticed before. She softened. She reconsidered her views. And then she left her whole family behind, left the church, and became a writer and educator on topics of extremism, bullying, and empathy. She changed, and she weakened a hateful group because some people on Twitter listened to her. I mean, why would she ever have given up a family who demonized others for others who demonized her family? Somebody had to do something different. She encountered good listeners, and together they exemplified what we now know to be true. Extremists who feel heard speak more softly. Extremists who do not feel heard become more extreme. When one party shouts, the other party shouts louder. An egotistical spirit escalates conflict and increases difference. It does not matter what kind of interaction we're talking about. When it all comes back to the I, we may get a temporary charge that feels good for a little while, but that dissipates. When we listen, it's all about the other and all about the ability to connect across difference. And then we have plugged into the source. Then we have created community. Then we have loved our neighbor. Then we have participated in the Spirit. Then we have been church. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. When we connect with another human, really connect through compassion and curiosity and courage, we invite God to be there too. We manifest the divine. Amen.